Thomas Edlington had never been one to ask for help. Not when his back first went out after 20 years of labor-intensive work in carpentry and construction, not during the 2 grueling surgeries that followed, and certainly not when he signed the paperwork that finalized the trade of his old duplex in the city for a smaller, quieter home on the edge of a suburban development that he had never even visited in person. It wasn't that he was stubborn, though he'd admit to that on occasion, but more that he had spent his entire adult life handling things himself, quietly and competently. The kind of man who measured twice, cut once, and didn't like to waste words or time. The new house wasn't glamorous, but it had a sturdy porch, a flat lot that wouldn't strain his knees too much, and enough room in the back to set up a small woodworking shed once he got back on his feet. More importantly, it offered something he hadn't had in months: quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't filled with hospital intercoms, ringing phones, or city sirens. He'd picked it not because he dreamed of moving to the suburbs, but because the place had a ramp-ready entrance and an open layout that allowed him to move freely with the heavy-duty orthopedic brace he now wore on his right leg and lower spine. The first few days were manageable. There were boxes to unpack, minor repairs to do, and a long list of little projects he intended to tackle slowly over time. The porch railing needed tightening, the back steps were a bit loose, and there was a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink that probably hadn't been touched in years. He liked that kind of work. It gave him purpose, made his hands feel useful again. Most of all, it distracted him from the slow, frustrating recovery his doctors had warned him about. He wasn't in a wheelchair, not yet, but he moved slowly, with a kind of precision that drew attention. His gait was uneven, his hands sometimes trembled when lifting anything heavier than a cup of coffee, and he winced more often than he realized. But he never complained. One of the first things Thomas did was install a mechanical platform lift on the side of the porch. It wasn't anything fancy, no flashing lights or digital controls, but it was sturdy, safe, and allowed him to move from the driveway to the main entrance without risking a fall or aggravating the healing vertebrae that were still held together by a lattice of metal rods and surgical screws. He built the platform himself using reinforced wood, steel brackets, and a small lift engine he'd ordered online. The whole thing was within local code and regulations, and though it wasn't aesthetically beautiful, it was functional. He finished it in one weekend, wiped the sweat from his brow, and thought nothing of it again until the following Thursday, when he was approached by a woman in a crisp beige sweater and pearl earrings as he was bringing in groceries. She was the kind of woman whose voice already sounded like a complaint even before she spoke, whose posture exuded control and self-importance. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't offer a neighborly welcome or ask if he needed a hand. She just stood there, one hand on her hip, sunglasses perched on the crown of her neatly arranged silver hair, and let her gaze wander over the platform. "That's quite a structure," she said eventually, the tone flat, as if she were discussing a pile of unsorted trash rather than an accessibility device. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He placed the last bag on the porch, adjusted the brace on his leg, and turned to face her. "It does the job," he said. She offered a thin smile. "You know," she began, "we try to maintain a certain visual standard in this neighborhood. Aesthetic cohesion. I'm not sure that apparatus meets our guidelines." Thomas kept his voice level. "It's not a decorative piece," he said plainly. "It's medical." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if sizing him up. "You don't look like you need it," she replied, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. That line sat in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite caught yet, irritating and persistent. He didn't dignify it with a response, just nodded once and turned to go inside, his back already aching from standing too long. He heard her murmur something under her breath as she walked away, but the words were lost to the breeze. Later, he found out her name was Karen Hoffner. She was the self-appointed president of the neighborhood association, a position she had apparently held for more than a decade through some combination of intimidation, bureaucracy, and aggressive friendliness. People tolerated her. Some even liked her or pretended to for the sake of peace. Thomas didn't care either way. He wasn't looking to make enemies, but he also wasn't going to live at the mercy of someone else's sense of symmetry. He had built the ramp because he needed it. That was the end of it, at least he thought so. But that night he found a flyer taped to his mailbox. Attention residents, all modifications to exterior structures must be pre-approved by the Neighborhood Aesthetic Council. The words non-compliant structures are subject to review and removal were underlined in red. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it didn't have to be. Thomas recognized the message for what it was, a warning. And like all warnings, it carried a simple subtext: someone was watching. Over the next few days, he noticed small things. A trash can slightly moved from its spot. A delivery package that looked like it had been opened and resealed. Someone walking by a little too slowly in the evening, looking at the porch lift just a little too long. He shrugged it off. Paranoia, he told himself. He'd been through worse. Let the busybodies talk. He wasn't breaking any laws, wasn't bothering anyone. He figured it would blow over. He figured wrong. It happened a week later, a Sunday morning, quiet and cloudless. Thomas had just finished making coffee and was flipping through a dog-eared hardware catalog when he heard a hollow, metallic crack from outside. It was sharp, final, like the sound of something giving way under pressure. He rushed to the door, opened it too fast, the motion pulling at his hip, and stepped out onto the porch. The lift was gone, not removed, not disassembled, destroyed. The platform had been torn apart at the joints, screws pulled loose, wood splintered, the control unit smashed like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. For a long moment he just stood there, hands gripping the porch railing, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't weather damage. This wasn't vandalism by bored teenagers. It was deliberate, calculated. The kind of destruction that takes time. The kind of thing someone does when they want you to know it was personal. When they want you to feel small. And in that moment, despite everything he had been through, despite the surgeries, the recovery, the pain, Thomas Edlington felt something deeper than rage or disbelief. He felt hunted. And then, just as he turned to go back inside and call someone, anyone he saw it. A white envelope, tucked neatly between the broken slats of the platform, as if placed there with great care. No name. No address. Just 2 words handwritten across the front in neat cursive, not approved. Thomas didn't call the police right away. He stood there, staring at the jagged remains of what used to be his platform lift, the splintered edges of the wood catching the morning sun like raw wounds. The machinery was smashed so thoroughly that it looked like whoever did it had gone back over it multiple times just to make sure it couldn't be salvaged. The metal base was bent and warped, the electrical wiring torn out and left dangling, frayed and burnt at the ends. Whoever it was hadn't been in a hurry. They had taken their time. This wasn't impulsive. This was a message. He felt the weight of that envelope between his fingers, not approved. Such a calm, cold phrase. No threats. No insults. Just a tidy summary of violence. The kind of message that didn't yell, it whispered. He went inside, his hands trembling slightly, and placed the envelope on the kitchen table without opening it. He already knew what was inside. It wouldn't be helpful. It wouldn't contain an apology or an explanation, just more paperwork. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, staring at the broken fragments of the lift through the front window. He didn't feel scared, not exactly, but something had shifted. It wasn't just vandalism. It wasn't even about aesthetics anymore. This was about power, about someone who believed they had the right to dictate how he lived, what he was allowed to need, and how visible that need could be. He didn't look disabled enough, apparently. And so the thing that made his life marginally easier had to be erased. Quietly. Brutally. He spent the rest of the day documenting everything. He took photographs of the damage from every angle, including close-ups of the crushed motor casing, the sheared bolts, and the tire tracks that trailed away from the property like a signature left in the dirt. He printed them out and placed them in a manila folder, added a written summary of when he'd installed the lift and the exact materials he'd used, and clipped copies of the receipts and the installation manual to the back. He kept everything simple, unemotional, factual. He'd learned a long time ago that getting angry didn't help. What helped was evidence. The following morning, he drove to the city building department. It took longer than he expected. There was a line, and the clerk behind the counter had the flat effect of someone who had seen too many people with too many problems, but eventually, he got a meeting with someone from the code enforcement office. The woman was in her late 50s, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She flipped through the file he'd prepared, nodded at the photos, and raised her eyebrows at the envelope. "Not approved?" she repeated. "That's not from us." She typed something into her computer, checked a database, then looked back at him. "You've got no violations on record. That lift wasn't even subject to permit review, because it was categorized under accessibility modifications. You were in the clear." Thomas nodded. "So what happens now?" She gave a small shrug. "If you file a vandalism report, we can make a note and open a civil case if you suspect someone specific. But unless you've got a name or a video, it's a long road. We're not law enforcement." He left the office with a copy of the regulations in his hand and a knot in his stomach. He'd half expected that. Whoever had done it had counted on exactly this kind of bureaucratic limbo, a gray zone where no one would be held accountable, where nothing would be pursued unless he made it a full-time job. He didn't want a war. He just wanted his platform back. But wanting something simple didn't mean it came easy. By the end of the week, he had a new design ready, stronger, more compact, with reinforced sides and a locking hatch. He sourced the materials from a vendor outside the area, just in case. As he was unloading them, a car pulled up at the curb, same beige SUV, same woman. Karen stepped out without shutting the door behind her, arms folded, a neutral smile stretched across her face like taut thread. "I see you're rebuilding," she said, her tone light, conversational, but with that unmistakable undercurrent of threat. "I hope you remembered to file this time." Thomas didn't turn to face her. "The city says I don't need to." She gave a soft, pitying laugh. "Oh, Thomas, the city doesn't live here." "We do." She leaned forward slightly. "You can try, to push through it. But the board has the final say." He looked up, finally meeting her gaze. "There's no board. There's just you." Karen's expression didn't change. There's a reason people follow the rules. Harmony, order, a sense of shared values. When one person decides they're an exception, it causes tension. And when there's tension, things start to break down. She gestured vaguely toward the street. "It's not personal. We just don't want the neighborhood to fall apart." He let out a long breath. "You don't want to look at people like me," he said quietly. "That's all this is." Her smile tightened, ever so slightly. "If that's what you choose to believe, I can't stop you. But don't say I didn't warn you." She got back into her car and drove off, and for the first time, Thomas felt something deeper than frustration. He felt the cold burn of inevitability. This wasn't going to stop. She had power, not because it was given to her, but because everyone else was too tired or too afraid to take it away. And he disabled, quiet, knew was the perfect target. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios. He didn't want revenge. He wanted dignity, safety, a place where he didn't have to explain his needs to people who didn't care to understand them. But the world wasn't built for people like him. It was built for people like Karen, well-dressed, articulate, endlessly righteous. She could destroy him in 10 polite letters and never raise her voice. The next morning, he filed a police report. He didn't expect much. The officer at the desk was polite but disinterested. No cameras, no witnesses, no suspects. Just a list of damages and a copy of the not-approved note, which the officer stapled to a standard form. "We'll keep this on file," he said, and that was that. When Thomas stepped outside the station, he stood for a moment on the sidewalk, staring at the traffic. He felt small. Not weak, he'd endured too much for that, but invisible. As if the world had quietly shifted and he'd been left behind. But even in that moment, with his back aching and his patience worn thin, he knew one thing for certain. If they wanted to erase him, they were going to have to work a lot harder. The new platform took 3 days to build. Thomas worked in measured silence, not because he feared someone would interfere again, but because the air had changed. He could feel it in the way the neighborhood watched him, subtle, quiet, as if every step he took was a disruption. It wasn't overt. No one said a word to his face. But there was a tension in the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming, in the sudden drop in conversation when he passed by, in the drawn curtains at windows that had previously remained open. He'd seen enough in life to recognize the early signs of isolation. The new design was an improvement: stronger joints, metal plating, a motor casing with a locking panel, and he reinforced the bolts with industrial epoxy, not just screws. The structure gleamed in the sunlight, not flashy but solid, built with hands that knew how to make things last. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it, not with pride, exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had rebuilt what others tried to break. He didn't expect applause. He just hoped to be left alone. That hope didn't survive the week. It began with the garbage. One morning, his bins, normally lined up neatly beside the curb, were overturned. Trash was scattered across the lawn, the bags torn open with surgical precision. It didn't look like animals. The cuts were too clean, the distribution too deliberate. Coffee grounds were smeared across the steps of the porch. An empty can of varnish from his workshop lay crushed next to the mailbox, even though he'd disposed of it days ago. He cleaned it up without comment, ignoring the neighbor across the street who stood at their window, watching but not offering a word. The next day, his mailbox was stuffed with local flyers, dozens of the same ad for lawn maintenance, all shoved inside until the door hung open. The following morning, his motion light was shattered. Thomas documented everything. Photos, notes, timestamps. He wasn't paranoid, he was methodical. And still, he didn't act. Not yet. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe some line to be crossed. Maybe the feeling that it wasn't just harassment anymore, but something closer to punishment. That line came on the 6th day. He was coming home from a follow-up visit to the orthopedic specialist. The appointment had run late, and it was already evening when he pulled into the driveway. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the yard. As he stepped out of the truck, he immediately saw it. The platform was gone. Not destroyed this time. Removed. It was surgically clean, no debris, no broken pieces, no sign of force. The bolts had been unthreaded, not cut. The wiring had been carefully unplugged, not ripped. It had been a professional job, and it had been done while he was out for no more than 5 hours. There was no note this time, just an empty space where mobility had once existed. He stood there, motionless, until the porch light clicked on. Then, without a word, he turned and went back to his truck. He didn't call the police. He drove. 25 minutes later, he pulled into the city records office, which stayed open late on Thursdays. He walked slower than usual, pain flaring in his hip, past the front desk, up the stairs, and straight into the planning archives. The clerk on duty recognized him from his earlier visit and offered a nod. Thomas placed a new file on the counter. "I want to know who filed the complaints," he said calmly. "The ones about my lift." "All of them." The clerk hesitated. "We can't release personal names in public reports." Thomas nodded. "Then I want copies of every anonymous filing related to my address, any safety citations, any aesthetic violations, anything dated in the last 2 months. The clerk tapped keys for several minutes, then printed out a stack of forms. As he handed them over, he frowned. "That's unusually detailed. Most complaints are a paragraph or two. These are pages long. Photos attached. Diagrams." Thomas took the papers. He didn't speak again until he was back in his truck, reading the documents by the yellow glow of the dome light. The reports were meticulous, page after page, filed over several weeks, each citing different angles: safety risk, obstruction of view, non-compliance with visual standards, potential injury liability, unpermitted mechanical operation. One included a photo of Thomas standing on the porch, taken from the street. Another showed a close-up of the lift motor, with annotations pointing to what was labeled unprofessional welds. The language was formal, almost legalistic. It wasn't written by a concerned neighbor, it was written by someone with intent. At the bottom of each form was the same printed name, Karen Hoffner. That night, Thomas typed up a timeline. Dates, actions, responses or lack thereof. He printed out the city's own guidelines on accessibility modifications, highlighted the relevant statutes and made copies. He attached the photos of the vandalism, the garbage, the removed structure, and now the complaints themselves. He put everything into a black binder and placed it by the door. He didn't know where this was heading, but he knew he wasn't going to let it slide. The next morning, he delivered a formal letter to the neighborhood council, addressed to all sitting members, not just Karen. It included a polite but firm notice of his rights under city code, a demand for documentation of any future action related to his property, and a line stating that any further interference would be treated as targeted harassment and pursued through the appropriate channels. He didn't expect them to respond. They didn't. Instead, the next day, the mail didn't come, not laid absent. The following day, the same. He walked down to the post office, where the clerk told him that delivery to his address had been suspended pending investigation of a safety hazard. She showed him a notice that had been submitted unsigned, typed, but detailed. It claimed that the platform had collapsed, nearly injuring a pedestrian, and that the area was now unsecure. Thomas pointed to the photo on the form, an image of the platform that had been removed. "That hasn't been on my property for 2 days," he said. The clerk shrugged. "We don't verify. We just follow directives." When he asked who filed it, she hesitated, then whispered, "Same name that filed about the dog barks last month." Then she added, as if to soften the blow, "You can request a hearing." Thomas nodded slowly, as if the world had begun to tilt, and he was trying to stay balanced. "I will," he said. On his way home, he stopped at a hardware store and bought a temporary ramp pre-built, aluminum, foldable. It wouldn't last, but it would hold for now. As he loaded it into the truck, he noticed a man in a collared shirt watching him from across the parking lot, standing beside a beige SUV. The man didn't speak. He didn't even look away when Thomas met his gaze. He just stood there, expressionless, hands in his pockets. Thomas drove home with his jaw clenched. That evening, he set up the temporary ramp, went inside, and locked the door. As the night fell around the house, silent and dense, Thomas sat at the table, binder open, pen in hand, and began writing down names. Not out of vengeance, out of necessity. Because he was no longer asking to be left alone. He was preparing for a fight. By the end of the second week, Thomas began to understand that the attacks weren't random, and the silence of the neighborhood wasn't just indifference, it was participation by omission. People knew, or at the very least suspected, what was happening to him, and yet no one spoke, no one intervened, no one even acknowledged it. They passed him on the street with tight smiles or eyes averted. A few offered empty greetings, the kind you give out of habit, not care. It wasn't fear exactly. Karen didn't rule by violence. She ruled by attrition, through policies and rules and a suffocating kind of politeness that smothered resistance before it could grow. And now Thomas was realizing that she didn't just have control of the association, she had it wrapped in layers of support from people who depended on her for neighborhood favor, who didn't want their bushes remeasured, their lawns cited, or their dues mysteriously increased. They stayed silent because silence was safer. Thomas didn't blame them. He just didn't have the luxury of silence anymore. The binder he had prepared began to grow, filling with not just documents but annotations, call logs, notes on every interaction he had with the city, the post office, The so-called board. He started keeping a daily journal, not out of paranoia but precision. Each entry was matter-of-fact, time-stamped, devoid of emotion. That was how you survived bureaucracy. You gave it data, not drama. Still, his nights were restless. He kept waking up at odd hours, convinced he'd heard a noise outside. Once he got out of bed and found his back gate unlatched. Another time, a shadow passed across his window just after midnight, but when he stepped out onto the porch, no one was there. And then something changed. It wasn't what happened that night, it was what didn't. One morning, Thomas found a note stuck to his door. It wasn't from Karen. It wasn't even signed. The paper was plain, handwritten in block letters. They did the same to Miller on Tulip Street. He moved. She won. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd gotten from anyone in weeks. He didn't know who Miller was, but he made a note, did a quick search of past property transfers, and found that a small house on Tulip had changed hands about 4 months ago. Cash sale, immediate transfer, no listing, no visible renovations, just a disappearance. That same afternoon, Thomas called the legal aid office the city clerk had once recommended. He dismissed the idea earlier, not wanting to make things more complicated, but now it felt necessary. The woman who answered MS. Abbott listened patiently as he explained his situation. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she asked for his address and said she'd call him back in 2 days. We don't usually get involved in neighborhood disputes, she said carefully, but if there's a pattern of targeted action, especially one that overlaps with accessibility issues, then there may be something actionable. 2 days later, she called. Her tone was different. I reviewed the documents you dropped off. I also did a bit of digging on my own. Your neighbor, M.S. Hoffner, has filed a disproportionate number of complaints over the last 4 years. Most are directed at residents who've made any visible modifications: awnings, ramps, solar panels. Anything that breaks the aesthetic she's so focused on. 3 of those residents sold within 6 months of the first citation. 1 filed a grievance with the county but dropped it without explanation. The city files make her look clean, but the pattern stands. Thomas didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked, "So what does that mean?" "It means I think you're right," she replied. "And more importantly, it means we're not just talking about a neighbor being difficult, we're talking about someone systematically using policy tools to create unbearable living conditions for anyone she deems unsuitable. That crosses into harassment, and potentially more." A meeting was arranged for the following week. MS. Abbott explained that she'd start with a demand letter, a formal document outlining the timeline of events, violations of Thomas's legal rights, and a request for written confirmation that no further actions would be taken against his accessibility equipment. It would also notify the neighborhood management agency, if such an entity truly existed, of the potential for legal action. It wasn't a lawsuit, but it was the first step toward one. Thomas agreed. He asked her what he should do in the meantime. "Keep your binder updated," she said. "And don't react emotionally. They want you off balance. Don't give them that." That weekend, as he worked on repainting the back deck, his one small effort at normalcy, he noticed Karen walking past his property with another woman. Both wore matching windbreakers with the neighborhood logo stitched onto the chest. They paused at the edge of his lawn, whispering, eyes drifting over the ramp. The other woman scribbled something in a notebook. Thomas didn't wave. He didn't look away either. Eventually, they moved on. He went inside and added the observation to his journal. Later that night, he found a small package on his front step. No label. Inside was a plastic lawn sign, professionally printed with large black letters, "This house is out of compliance." He didn't throw it away. He placed it in the center of his dining table and stared at it until the sun went down. Then he took a deep breath and wrote one more note in his journal. "They want me gone. I'm staying." 2 days after the demand letter was sent, a new letter arrived, not in the mailbox this time, but taped directly to Thomas's front door. secured with 3 strips of heavy-duty packing tape, as though someone wanted to make absolutely certain he would see it before anything else. The paper was thick, watermarked, printed with the same serif font used in all prior notices, but this one had a different tone. It wasn't written by Karen directly, but by a private property compliance contractor operating on behalf of the neighborhood management team. The name of the company sounded fabricated, something generic and intentionally forgettable. The letter stated that Thomas's property had been flagged for a Level 3 inspection due to repeated non-compliance, and that his external fixtures, including but not limited to ramps, lifts, porch extensions, toolboxes, and non-conforming garden elements, would be subject to full visual and structural assessment within the next 72 hours. It didn't say who would be performing the inspection, or when exactly. Just that it would happen. He called the number listed and reached a voicemail that didn't identify the company or its representatives. He left a short, calm message asking for the inspection to be canceled, citing pending legal consultation. No one returned the call. Instead, the following morning, he woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel and found 2 men in matching khaki jackets in his front yard, one photographing the porch while the other scribbled notes on a clipboard. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared and began documenting every inch of his property. Thomas stepped outside and asked them who they were. The man with the camera didn't look up. The other one spoke with a clipped accent, refusing to provide ID, repeating only that they were conducting an approved inspection and that any interference would be reported as obstruction. Thomas, already in pain from a restless night, nearly lost his composure, but instead he turned, walked back into the house, and calmly called his attorney. Within 15 minutes, she was on the line with the City Code Enforcement Office. 20 minutes after that, an email arrived stating no such inspection had been authorized or approved by any recognized municipal body. The men were trespassing, but by the time Thomas went back outside, they were gone, their tire tracks already fading into the road dust. That night, his temporary ramp was sabotaged, not destroyed, but tampered with one of the support brackets unscrewed just enough to tilt it off balance when stepped on. If Thomas hadn't noticed the shift under his weight, he could have fallen. He removed the ramp completely and spent an hour inspecting every bolt, every weld. He didn't sleep. He stayed on the porch until morning, a cold cup of coffee clutched in his hand, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. By week's end, he'd received 5 more letters. One questioned the legality of the height of his porch railing. Another claimed he was in violation of local sound ordinances due to tool use outside regulated hours, even though he hadn't touched his tools in days. One was a warning that further non-response to notices would lead to escalated fees. 2 were duplicates of previous violations, backdated to appear as if they had been unresolved for over a month. He sorted and scanned each one, sending copies to MS. Abbott. Her replies became more urgent, more detailed. She began drafting a formal complaint, this time not just against Karen but against the association as a whole and the contractors acting under its name. The situation shifted again the next time he left the house. He had a doctor's appointment, the kind he couldn't miss, and when he returned 3 hours later, something felt off the moment he stepped out of the truck. The air felt still, too still, like the street had been frozen mid-breath. He looked at his house and knew. The door to his tool shed was open. He never left it open. Inside, the shed had been rifled through. Nothing stolen, nothing obviously broken, but disturbed as labeled bins had been moved, several drawers slightly opened. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal. A box of nails had been tipped over and carefully set upright again, as if someone had tried to hide the fact they'd been inside. He walked back into the house and double-checked his locks, then installed temporary alarms on every window. The next morning, he found the motion sensor light by the back door twisted sideways and covered in a plastic bag secured with tape. There were no messages this time. No new letters. Just the creeping certainty that someone wanted him to feel watched. Unstable, unsure of when or how the next intrusion would come. Not all attacks were physical. Some were psychological, slow erosions of safety meant to make the target paranoid enough to dismantle themselves. Thomas didn't crumble. Instead, he escalated. He filed a formal police report, this time requesting a copy be sent to his attorney and a second to the city ombudsman. He submitted a security request to a local surveillance installer and scheduled a consultation. He replaced his shed lock with a reinforced deadbolt. He called the postal inspector and reported the harassment regarding his mail. He documented everything in a new binder read, this one, separate from the black one that held the past events. He labeled the cover phase 2. Not because he expected this would end soon, but because he understood now that he was in the middle of something larger than one neighbor's obsession with control. This was systemic, supported by weak rules and weaker resistance. The next weekend, the escalation reached its cruelest form yet. It was Saturday morning. Thomas had slept for once and was sitting with a cup of coffee, reading through contractor quotes for a permanent lift installation. He heard an engine outside and assumed it was the delivery truck he'd scheduled for later that day. But when he stepped out, he froze. A flatbed tow truck was parked at the end of his driveway. The driver was on the phone. On the truck bed was his pickup, his own vehicle, hooked up and partially lifted off the ground. He approached the driver, confused, heart pounding in his throat. "What are you doing?" The man looked up. Vehicles being impounded, violation of community vehicle compliance. Thomas stared at him. "What violation?" The man shrugged. "I just got the work order." "It's registered to the association," said vehicles non-functional, improperly parked. "My truck runs fine. It's registered. I park it in my own driveway." The driver seemed genuinely indifferent. "Look, I don't make the calls. I just move the cars." Thomas called the police. When they arrived, the officer recognized him from prior complaints. After a short discussion and upon confirming the truck was indeed registered and legally parked, the tow driver was forced to release it. No apology, no further explanation. But the message had been delivered. They were done with the letters. Now they were trying to strip him of his mobility altogether. As the truck rumbled off and the officer finished his paperwork, Thomas stood in the driveway, his jaw tight, his muscles aching not just from age or injury, but from something deeper, a war weariness of being harassed without visible scars, pushed without the world ever seeing a hand raised. Inside the house, he sat at the table, opened the red binder, and began another page. At the top he wrote, "They came for the ramp. Now the truck. What next?" Then he underlined it. And wrote, in careful letters, "This is not intimidation. This is strategy." Thomas hadn't left the house in 3 days. Not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating. Each morning he woke up earlier, moved slower, watched more closely. The quiet had turned from unsettling to tactical. He made coffee like clockwork, sat in the same spot by the window, and studied the rhythms of the street. Every delivery van, every walker with a dog, every parked car that lingered too long. His world had narrowed to angles, timing, and shadows. The game had changed. This wasn't just pressure anymore. It was siege warfare. And Karen, whether she operated alone or through others, wasn't letting up. He wondered what it must have felt like to do this so methodically to someone and then walk your poodle like you'd just arranged the roses. On the fourth morning, it happened. At 5:47 a.m., just as the sky was shifting from gray to blue, a dark SUV pulled up across the street. No plates on the front. Tinted windows. No movement for the first few minutes. Then 2 figures emerged, one with a clipboard, the other holding a case. They moved with practiced pace, straight for the front porch. Thomas remained where he was, seated at the table in full view of the window, eyes fixed on them as they examined the side wall, the new support structure he'd installed, at the threshold of his entryway. The one with the clipboard took notes. The other placed something against the siding, some kind of meter, and tapped it twice before looking down at the screen. When Thomas opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, they didn't flinch. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady, as if he hadn't been rehearsing that line in his head for hours. The man with the case turned to him. "You're not on the schedule," he said. "This property is under evaluation for safety retrofit compliance." "By who?" Thomas asked. The clipboard man spoke now. "Neighborhood Development Oversight, per Community Regulation subsection 12.7. You should have received a copy of the adjustment notice." His voice was flat, official, and wrong. "There is no oversight office," Thomas said. "And there is no subsection 12.7. That was repealed 2 years ago." A pause. The man lowered the clipboard slightly. "I suggest you leave," Thomas said. "Right now. Or I'll call the city inspector directly." The man with the case didn't move, but the other stepped back, slowly, like someone retreating from a bluff they suddenly weren't sure was a bluff. Then both turned without another word and walked back to the SUV, the vehicle pulling away a little too fast to be casual. Thomas waited until they were out of sight before going back inside. He didn't go to his desk. He went to the kitchen, pulled a worn envelope from the drawer, and retrieved a contact card, one he hadn't thought he'd need again. Then he picked up the phone and called the city ombudsman's office. Not the general line. The direct number he'd been given after a previous call had caught someone's attention. "I've had unauthorized agents on my property," he said. "They claimed authority that doesn't exist. I believe my case has escalated beyond civil interference." The woman on the other end didn't argue. She said she'd call back. When she did, 23 minutes later, she gave him a name. A mid-level city compliance officer who had flagged several homes in his area for potential acquisition under a dormant redevelopment clause that hadn't been used in nearly a decade. Somehow his name had been added to the list 3 weeks ago, shortly after he'd begun receiving letters about his ramp. "It shouldn't have triggered anything," she said. "But there's an administrative link between the private neighborhood group and one of our old zoning databases. I'll need time to see how it got activated." "Time is something they're counting on me not to have," Thomas replied. That night, he checked every lock twice, bolted the garage, tested the sensors. Then he sat in his chair and waited. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was pattern recognition. At 2:16 a.m., his motion sensor tripped. He didn't jump. He didn't move immediately. He watched the monitor from the small setup he'd installed on a whim. The camera showed 3 people near the back gate, all wearing dark jackets, one with something metallic slung over his shoulder. Another carried a tool bag. They moved without talking. They knew the path. They weren't improvising. Thomas reached for the phone. He called 911, gave his name, his address, and said clearly, "There are 3 people on my property. They are attempting to access the structure. I am inside. I am not armed. I need immediate police response." He stayed on the line. Outside, the figures moved to the rear corner of the shed. One pulled a crowbar. Then the floodlights snapped on. The men froze, looked up, and the voice of the dispatcher on the phone informed Thomas that 2 units were en route. 5 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the entire street. Neighbors emerged from their doors in robes, some holding phones, others just peering through windows. The intruders were already gone, vanished between the houses, but the tire tracks were there, and the camera had everything. The police took the footage, the statements, the timestamps. They left nothing to question. By morning, Thomas's case had shifted. MS. Abbott called him, voice tense with disbelief. "You're not just dealing with HOA pettiness anymore. Someone tried to physically dismantle your home. This crosses legal boundaries by miles." Thomas didn't respond with anger or fear. He just said, "I'm ready for it to end." Later that day, he received a message from the city compliance office. The flag status on his property had been revoked. An investigation had been opened into misuse of zoning databases. The names behind the activation were being reviewed. And on his porch, taped sloppily to the railing, was a final handwritten note. Some fights aren't worth it. Walk away. He stared at it for a long time, then tore it down. And didn't walk away. The neighborhood didn't return to normal. Not for Thomas, and not for the people who had watched in silence as he was pushed closer to the edge by a campaign no one wanted to acknowledge. The house remained the same, its walls solid, its windows clean, its porch once again fitted with a reinforced and fully permitted platform lift, but the air around it had changed. Conversations quieted when he stepped outside. Gardeners averted their eyes. Some neighbors who had previously nodded now looked away entirely, as if making eye contact might draw them into something they couldn't control or explain. Karen Hoffner had not been seen in 3 days. Her car was parked at a sharp angle in her driveway, and the blinds in her front windows remained permanently drawn. Rumors began to pass in uncertain whispers, something about city investigators, inquiries into financial records, a review of how certain private groups had been granted unusual administrative access to government databases. But no one said her name aloud when Thomas was near. The legal team had filed the official complaint 3 days after the attempted break-in. It wasn't just about harassment anymore, it had grown into a case that exposed a deeper rot in how private authority had been allowed to masquerade as public regulation. The city ombudsman had launched a formal review, not just of the zoning manipulation that nearly forced Thomas out of his home, but of the connections between neighborhood boards and dormant redevelopment codes that had been quietly reactivated in several districts. His was the first, but not the only case. Others began to come forward, residents from different streets, people who had been fined, threatened, or pushed out under the same vague terminology and fake inspections. The investigation grew beyond him, and Thomas led it. He handed over documents, copies of letters, timestamps from his journal. He answered questions calmly, directly. But he didn't seek revenge. He didn't call for Karen to be removed or prosecuted. That wasn't his role. The mailbox was finally unblocked. The city ordered a temporary freeze on all aesthetic enforcement actions across the neighborhood pending full review. His property, once the target of endless notices and shadow inspections, was declared fully compliant. His attorney called it a landmark decision. The city's email called it an administrative correction. Thomas just called it breathing room. A month passed. Spring arrived slowly, softening the sharpness of winter and letting green return to the hard edges of the street. The grass along his front lawn grew a little too high, and no one complained. A neighbor from 2 houses down, someone he hadn't spoken to beyond a wave, stopped by one morning with a tin of coffee cake and said she'd been meaning to talk to him for weeks, but hadn't known what to say. He thanked her and didn't press. 2 days later, her husband brought over a set of new deck screws and left them quietly on the porch. No words, no note, just the gesture. Karen's house eventually went up for sale. No sign. Just a quiet listing on a private site, followed by a moving truck that came and went within a single day. When it pulled away, no one came outside to wave her off. No one helped her carry boxes. The house sat empty for weeks before a new family moved in, young parents, 2 kids, a golden retriever who barked with too much joy to be ignored. So Thomas watched them from the porch as they wrestled with lawn chairs and a trampoline frame. When they finally noticed him, they waved with both hands. He raised a hand in return, slow and deliberate, and for the first time in a long while he smiled. He didn't rebuild the ramp again. He didn't need to. The lift stayed, strong and humming with a quiet confidence that matched the way he now walked, still measured, still cautious, but unbending. The neighborhood committee held elections at the end of the season. Thomas didn't run, but someone nominated him anyway, and he declined politely. He didn't want to sit behind a table and argue about mailbox colors or shrub height. He'd already done more for the neighborhood by standing his ground than he ever could in a meeting room. Sometimes people would still ask him softly, carefully, why he didn't just move, why he stayed after everything that had been done. He always gave the same answer, spoken without anger, without pride, but with something steadier beneath the words. Because I didn't do anything wrong.